group of people we have to speak with you tonight. First is Dr. Tom Brocher. As Annette mentioned, he's a research geophysicist at the USGS. Their office is less than a mile from here on Middlefield. He was the director of the Earthquake Science Center, and he is an expert in seismology, earthquake hazard assessment, mitigation, and preparedness. So his talk will be, I think, very salient. Remember, the problem we have as humans is that we tend to only be able to really focus on one thing at a time, and we're susceptible to manipulation. The news media, certain politicians, right? They make us pay attention to things that may or may not be important. Earthquakes, unfortunately, are always important to pay attention to.
Well, thank you, Ken. I'm Tom Brocher with the USGS, and I've been asked to tell you a little bit about earthquakes. And I wanted to, first of all, let you know there's a couple of handouts on the table over there. One talks about what we can expect in the next 30 years in terms of earthquakes, and the other talks about earthquake early warning, and I'll be talking about both of these in my talk. And I'll also be talking quite a bit about the Hayward Fault and the 1868 Hayward earthquake, and I'll tell you why during the talk. So this slide shows you the arrow is the timeline of the earthquakes in the Bay Area, starting in the gold rush in 1850 and moving to the right. And so you can see the big dot is 1906, magnitude 7.8 earthquake. And you can see all the little dots before that. In the 50 years before the 1906 earthquake, the Bay Area had a big earthquake, a magnitude 5 to 6, even a 7, every few years. So the Bay Area really knew that it was earthquake country. Look what happened after 1906, very few dots. So 1906 was such a big earthquake that it's really released most of the stress in the Bay Area. And so we've had very few big earthquakes since 1906, the biggest one being in 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake. The dashed horizontal line, it shows you the magnitude of the level of damaging earthquakes, which is about a magnitude. We don't get terribly excited in my profession until we get about a magnitude 5.5 or 6. That's when we really start to see some damage. Whoops. I don't mean to scare people, and the next slide is it's a slide that's familiar to every geology student who's ever taken Geology 101. And the reason it's familiar is that it's used to show the offset that was produced by the 1906 earthquake. And you can see this fence line, and I think this is up in Marin County, this fence line on this farm. One side of the fault moved the fence about 10 feet north of the other side. And geologists ooh and ah about that. But what I want you to notice are the buildings in the background. So here we have these buildings, and we had the big San Andreas Fault, big magnitude 7.8 earthquake in this person's backyard, and their house and their buildings look fine. So that's why I think experience has shown that most of us are not even going to be hurt by the earthquake, but we need to take some steps to help that along and to recover faster after the earthquake. This map shows the Bay Area. The red line on the left is the San Andreas Fault. The red line on the right is the Hayward Fault. You can see Palo Alto down at the bottom of the map. The little yellow areas outline the areas that were populated back in 1906. Okay? So you can see there wasn't much on the peninsula. And now the gray area shows you where we are now. So back in 1906, nobody lived on the fault. Now we do. Population's about 10 times higher than it used to be. And our hazard in Palo Alto and along the entire peninsula is high because we live so darn close to the San Andreas Fault. Okay, so the one handout shows you a couple of the figures are from this handout that gives you the update for the next 30 years. The map on the left is a map of the Bay Area, and the little dots, which you probably can't make out here, are the earthquakes in the past 40 years. These are all the magnitude 2s and above earthquakes. Most of these we wouldn't even feel. But you can see they do a very nice job of delineating the earthquake faults in the Bay Area. So the earthquakes are happening every day in the Bay Area. The map on the right shows you our estimate of the chance, of the likelihood of a damaging Loma Prieta type earthquake on each of these faults in the next 30 years. So you can see in the San Andreas Fault, which is our neighbor here, it's about 22% chance in the next 30 years. On the Hayward Fault, it's more like a 1 out of 3 chance. And the Bay Area wide, it's about a 3 out of 4 chance. So if I went to Vegas, which I don't, but if I went to Vegas, those are pretty darn good odds. I would take those odds, right? You would win some money taking those odds. So we're pretty good odds that we're going to have a damaging Loma Prieta type earthquake in the next 30 years, or bigger. Here's an expanded view of that, just to kind of focus on the central part of the Bay Area, and you can see Palo Alto. So you can see how close we are to the San Andreas Fault. We're very close to the Hayward Fault. We're sort of between them. And the big, thick colored lines are the major earthquake faults in the Bay Area that we think can produce a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake, damaging earthquake. But the little yellow lines are earthquake faults that are active as well. And they can produce magnitude 6s and maybe 6.5 earthquakes, which don't sound like much, but ask the people in Napa what a magnitude 6 earthquake can do. So those can also be very damaging locally. So we have a couple of those that are near Palo Alto, around on the peninsula. So if those were to rupture, they would locally cause a lot of damage. So why am I going to harp so much on the Hayward Fault? Well, the last earthquake on the Hayward Fault was 150 years ago in 1868, and at that time it was called the Great San Francisco Earthquake because it damaged San Francisco and it killed people in San Francisco. The missions were started in 1776 or so in San Francisco, and before that we have geological evidence of 12 earthquakes in the past 2,000 years. The past 5 earthquakes have been 155, reading along the top here. 2 of the earthquakes were 155 years apart, 2 were 160 years apart, 1 was 95 years apart, and another was 143 years apart, and now we're 150 years and counting. So we're in the window where we can expect a Hayward Fault earthquake, which is, they're thought to be on the order of a magnitude 6.8, 6.9 magnitude earthquake. And the 150th anniversary will be on, this year on October 21st. So this map shows you the shaking levels that were produced by the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. And I'm wondering how many people were here for the Loma Prieta earthquake? Quite a few, okay. So you remember the level of shaking that you felt, and you can see the color code here. You can find where you were. Most of us really experienced what's labeled here light to moderate levels of shaking and didn't really see very much damage. You can see that's because the Loma Prieta earthquake ruptured in the Santa Cruz Mountains to the south. So it's actually not very close to us here. The 1868 earthquake, in contrast, is going to be was in the center of the Bay Area. And you can see, we think it ruptured the black line that you can see along the Hayward Fault in the East Bay, and probably ruptured near San Leandro. We're not quite sure where the epicenter was. But you can see there was very strong levels of damage in San Leandro, Hayward, Fremont. But also you can see kind of orange colors near Palo Alto. So we will expect some fairly strong shaking here in Palo Alto due to that Hayward earthquake. Now back in 1868, this top picture shows you what San Leandro looked like in the 1860s. About 500 people lived in San Leandro. Now we have about 100,000. The picture in the top shows you the whole town of San Leandro, and I've illustrated the courthouse. San Leandro was the county courthouse back in the day, and you can see the inset shows you the damage that was produced by the earthquake. So the damage to San Leandro was quite considerable. We are also learning that earthquakes don't necessarily go one bang and they're done. What we learned in the South Napa earthquake a few years ago is that the show may not be over. And on the left side, I show you the crack that was produced by the earthquake, and you can see the striping on the road is offset a little bit. And the picture on the right was taken the next day, and you can see that offset has grown. So even though it didn't produce a large earthquake, the fault was still moving for days after the earthquake. In fact, in some places it was moving for months after the earthquake. So we could have infrastructure and buildings and so on built on top of the fault or that cross the fault that are okay the day of the earthquake, but might rupture or have even more problems in the days following the earthquake. So that's something that we'll have to pay attention to, and we think this is potentially going to happen along the Hayward Fault. One of the reasons we think that is that along the Hayward Fault, we're seeing this constant motion, steady motion along the fault in the absence of large earthquakes. And this shows you a curve that was initially, that curve would have joined up nicely with the rounded part of the curve, but the steady motion along the Hayward Fault has shifted the curve about 4 inches over time. So we know the fault is moving. And most of you know about the San Andreas Fault, which produced the 1906 earthquake, and it also produced the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. The 1906 earthquake, we think, ruptured off this San Francisco Zoo, offshore just a couple miles or so, and it broke both to the north and to the south. And this is a shake map, and you can see that the strong shaking occurred along the entire north coast of California. So even though it's called the San Francisco earthquake, it really shook up all of Northern California. In fact, the strongest shaking and damage and fatalities per capita was in Santa Rosa. But it's not, we don't call it the Santa Rosa earthquake. So let me talk about one of the things we're doing to help mitigate earthquakes. So we're developing a system called earthquake early warning. Sometimes facetiously I call it earthquake last warning, because it's based on the premise that the earthquake has started. And so on the lower left, you can see the earthquake is started by the star, and the earthquake has produced 2 different kinds of waves. And the first waves, the fastest waves, come to us first, and those don't shake as hard as the second waves, which do the damage. So we can locate the earthquake using these first fast traveling waves, and we can detect where it happened and how big it was, and we can relay that information electronically ahead of the earthquake, and thereby get some seconds of warning. What it depends upon is having these sensors. I call them tripwires. We need to have lots of tripwires underground to detect the earthquake, and then we can determine where the earthquake was and broadcast that information ahead of the earthquake shaking. Now that tripwire system in Japan, the Japanese have a similar system, and it's been working for now, I think, about 10 years. And you can see the density of tripwires in Japan. All those little orange squares are their sensors. And in contrast, at the same scale, you can see the sensor network in California. And it's very good in LA area, and it's very good in the Bay Area, and it's not so good anywhere else in California. So the issue, we need, our sensor network is only about half to maybe 2/3 built. And so we need to keep working on building out that sensor network. So let's talk about the Berkeley earthquake from a couple of weeks ago. was about a magnitude 4.4, and that's about the size of earthquake that we think will start giving warnings for. So this is a shake map. No, I'm sorry, this is a did you feel it map. So about 40,000 people went onto our website after the earthquake and filled out the did you feel it. And so you can see the earthquake was felt from north of Santa Rosa all the way down to Monterey and even a little bit farther south, and as far east as Sacramento. So it was a very widely felt earthquake, even though it was not a very large earthquake. See, it was in Berkeley. So what kind of warning would we have gotten from this earthquake? Just to give you a little background, so here's an expanded view of Berkeley. The earthquake epicenter was actually by the Claremont Hotel, if anyone knows the Claremont, or the Caldecott Tunnel. It's in that vicinity, just south of the campus at UC Berkeley. And then in that area, these other dots show you the previous earthquakes of about that magnitude that have happened. And in that area, for reasons that we don't really understand, there's been a series of earthquakes in that region. But to move on to the earthquake early warning part, and so the epicenter was in Berkeley. The green circle shows you where we would have received about 10 seconds of warning. So in Palo Alto, we would have gotten about 10 seconds of warning from that earthquake. And that's about as good as we can do based on the physics of earthquakes and the speed that the two different waves travel at. So if we had an earthquake, you can see that if we had an earthquake closer to Palo Alto, we would just move those circles closer to Palo Alto. So we were going to have less than 10 seconds of warning for earthquakes that are closer to Palo Alto. But there's a lot of applications that can use even a few seconds of warning. And BART is already using what we call the shake alert, the earthquake early warning system, to slow down trains. And in 10 seconds, BART can slow down a train by about 30 miles per hour. So you can imagine that will help reduce the casualties related to earthquakes and trains jumping off the tracks and that sort of thing. And so they're already using shake alert right now. We are working with other groups. I believe we're working with the Menlo Park Fire Department on automatic opening of fire doors at fire stations, so that when earthquakes happen and you get a lot of shaking, what can happen is that door frames get out of true. So it can be difficult to open the doors after the earthquake. So that's an application for doing something before the earthquake has actually struck, opening the doors so that the trucks can get out more readily. And so we're working with Menlo Park with that, but we're looking, I'm sure we'd be happy to work with Palo Alto as well. There's a current snag with earthquake early warning, and that is that most of the federal and cell phone providers in the US, the federal alert system, the AMBERS alert, they're not designed to operate instantaneously within seconds. And so they're not capable at the current time of pushing out earthquake notifications, earthquake early warning system. And that's because they've never had an application before that needed it. But now they've recognized the need for it, and so both the federal system and the cell phone providers are working on solutions to the issues that they have to do that. But one of the things I'd like to emphasize in all the talks that I give is the reason that we teach drop, cover, and hold on. And the reason is that the two ways you're most likely to be injured in an earthquake in California is that in a strong earthquake, you're going to be pushed down to the floor. You're going to be pushed over. And so a lot of people get injured falling over and hitting the ground. So that's why you drop. As soon as you feel the earthquake, you drop down in a controlled way so you don't get injured. The second thing, the other way you get hurt in California is that things start to fall on you. And so that's why you get underneath something that's going to give you a little cover so that those things don't land on you and hurt you. And you hold on to that thing that's giving you cover if it can move. Because we know in 1906 the shaking lasted for 45 seconds and all the furniture in the rooms just walked around the room. So if you're not holding on to that thing that's giving you cover, pretty soon you're not underneath that thing. Okay? So you've got to hold on to that thing and make sure you stay with it. And every year we teach this drill statewide and actually nationally now and internationally in something called Shakeout. It's always the third Thursday of the month of October. And this year it's going to be on October 19th at 10:19 a.m. So that's a really good way of practicing, okay, how do I drop, cover, and hold on, and also to practice other things you want to practice for your earthquake drill. The other thing I want to just chat or just talk about briefly is that we know that building retrofits work. And the reason we know that is that the new building codes work because in Japan, where they've had some really large earthquakes, the new building codes have done really well to protect the new buildings. But the issue that we have is that a lot of our buildings are older, and they weren't built to the current building code. But we know that it's possible to retrofit older houses. And there's a property owner in Santa Cruz, and for whatever reason, they bought two of the identical houses next to each other in Santa Cruz. And they had retrofit one of the houses before the Loma Prieta earthquake, and the other house they hadn't retrofit. So the house that was retrofit, and they were identical houses. They were exactly the same house. The one that had been retrofit did really well in the earthquake and had little minor damage, maybe a few $1,000s worth of damage. The other house practically fell apart and required hundreds of thousands of dollars to repair that house. So we know that retrofitting can work, and it can really prevent a lot of damage. And what it can do, in addition to saving you money, it gives you a place to stay after the earthquake, so you can shelter in place. You don't have to be evacuated. You don't have to leave your house, which after all is where you have most of your resources. The other thing I'm going to just encourage you all to think about is that in addition to retrofitting, think about your chimney. The level of shaking that I showed in those shake maps, level of shaking, intensity 7, intensity 8, that's when chimneys start falling down. So that's what we're going to see in a Hayward fault kind of earthquake in Palo Alto. So if you have a chimney, you can be proactive and have it replaced by a chimney that's metal pipe and wood frame. And so that's not going to fail during the earthquake, and it's not going to potentially fall into your house and cause damage or cause your house to be red tagged after the earthquake so that you'll have to leave your house. So, and the other sales pitch I'll make is that it's going to be a lot cheaper to do that after the earthquake, before the earthquake than after, because everyone is going to be trying to find a contractor to do some work on their house, and it's going to be very expensive to have any work done on your house. So again, if you do it now before the earthquake, you can schedule it at your convenience, and you probably pay less money to have that done. The USGS, and we have some of them here, we have these guides for preparing for the next earthquake. They're in English as the Putting Down Roots in Earthquake Country, but they're also in Spanish and Chinese, Vietnamese, and Korean. And these are all available online. And again, they talk about, one of the things they talk about is the 7 steps to earthquake safety and preparedness. And 4 of the steps are things you can do before the earthquake. And it's things like securing your space, making sure that things are not going to become airborne and land on you during the earthquake, making sure your hot water heater is well strapped. developing your plan to reconnect with your family and loved ones after the earthquake, organizing your disaster kit, emergency kit that includes your prescription medicines, as well as plenty of water, because our water comes to us from the Sierras and crosses 3 active faults to get to us. It's always good to have a little water on hand. And you can do, as I said, you can retrofit your house. And the picture there on the lower left, lower right corner shows some workmen in the crawl space of a house. And basically, if you have a crawl space or a garage and you can see 2x4s, that's a great target to put up some nice plywood. And that's called shear walling your house. And that will make that wall and that much stronger and much more resistant to failing in an earthquake, and probably save you a lot of damage to your house. And it's not very expensive. So I think I'm just about at the end. So yeah, so we're definitely an earthquake country. We have a history of damaging earthquakes in the Bay Area, but we know now that we can prepare for earthquakes. There's no need to be a victim. You can get ready, you can prepare your house and your family for an earthquake, and you can take this step now and you'll be much better prepared to recover from the earthquake. Thank you very much.